TV cartoon superhero made his premiere. This is Underdog, who in time became a semi-classic character. The show ran until the mid-70s, after which Underdog appeared intermittently in comic books, t-shirts, and a few commercial toys. Now here it is, 1989, 25 years since his debut. This is Underdog's 25th, or silver, anniversary. To celebrate, we have Underdog with us, or at least someone playing his part, in a series of special appearances being made in '89. Here is Suzanne Muldowney of Delran, New Jersey, as Underdog in his silver anniversary classic. How did you choose and get started on Underdog?
Well, there were quite a few reasons. The earliest of which occurred when I was 5 to 6 years old. That was the time of the vintage Superman TV series with George Reeves. And I was especially attracted to the idea of a flying character. We have a great many fictional superheroes that kids go for, but not that many of them fly. So what attracted me most was the aerial element. Now, since that was several years before Underdog came out, I think what attracted me first to Underdog was my brothers would watch him, and his program was scheduled just before some other shows I wanted to see, so I'd always get the tail end of it. And in time, my curiosity got the better of me, and I would begin to watch some of the episodes. I know I was delighted to see that he was an aerialist, like Superman. It didn't start to really get a hold of me until about the beginning of '65. Then there were some rather significant steps. The first of which was an episode, a story in a Dennis the Menace comic book. Dennis's prudish girlfriend, Margaret, was on her way to a ballet lesson. Dennis watched her go through a few ballet steps, mostly kicks, spins, and especially big leaps. And when I saw the drawings of the girl making that particular series of steps, then I began to understand how certain movements were representative of acts which, to some extent, could be done only through specialized apparatus. George Reeves as Superman, for instance, had to be supported on wires or tables or other kinds of special gear to make him fly. But these dance steps were the way that an ordinary mortal could simulate something like flying within human limitations. But then, then from there I began to take an interest in ballet or other kinds of theatrical dance, because I figured I was going to try to portray the part of Underdog. I felt myself being more drawn to him. I was in my early teens at this time. See, Underdog came out when I was 12, which kind of helped a bit later on when I began to analyze the show. What happened at near the end of 1965 was what mystery writers might call the clincher. On November 25th, which was Thanksgiving Day, there were many Thanksgiving parades being held. Now, Macy's parade in New York was about to televise theirs, and they were going to use Underdog in helium balloon form. When I was watching that parade and watching for that particular balloon, I was transfixed by what I saw, not only because the commentators gave the Underdog balloon such a heroic welcome, but also there was a big production, a big presentation built around the balloon's appearance. Some other actors or some other personnel staged a mock situation which Underdog would try to remedy. But because such a big production was made around the appearance of the balloon, I figured, well, Underdog had to be a rather significant character. So that was the clincher. And by now, since I was taking dance lessons, I figured I had to assume his identity to portray him primarily through some kinds of dance movements.
Did you find the Underdog great, or were there good and bad points?
Well, there were definitely a lot of bad points. I think first I ought to emphasize the good points. What I've liked most in heroic characters, maybe whether they're heroic or whether they're more down to earth or whether they're supposedly super heroic, was their sense of goodwill. They would not be solicited to do something. Sometimes they did, but other times they did it freely. Um, as far as combating wrongdoers, that's probably a staple with every fictional hero. But I think sometimes you could be up against odds other than human odds. There could be natural disasters or unforeseen circumstances or simply even preventative measures. What also helps and proves more noteworthy of a character is if he goes on heroic missions of a rescue nature. That doesn't necessarily involve some human or non-human adversary. He goes to the help of somebody who's somehow gone into trouble. Well, as far as flaws in the character and the show, uh, partly because I was in my early teens when the show first came out, I was able to analyze the show better than a younger child who might have taken everything he saw as gospel. I was able to analyze the show for good and bad points, and I guess to some extent the believability. I had never thought of Underdog as having any kind of bad points per se until other members of my family force-fed negative viewpoints on me. The first of which being that Underdog was supposedly strictly a satire of other characters like Superman. I was particularly shocked to learn that the word underdog meant born loser or disfavored person, and that made me think, in time, why would the characters and show's originators give him that name if that was what the word really meant? And why would they want to make him satirical? Because they must have known that sooner or later they'd be criticized and rebuked for it. One of the most devastating or desecrating elements I found in the Underdog character and series was the high degree of slapstick and clumsiness. Most of the time, Underdog was made to enter or exit by crashing through something like a building or demolishing some property. I thought that was most inappropriate. The slapstick, too, he would be too easily entrapped by his adversaries, or like I said before, too many times have mishaps or accidents. And there's also the risk of a high degree of violence. That's something for which TV shows or virtually any kind of dramatizations are constantly scrutinized and or criticized for if they seem to have too much violence. There was also the case of the characters and the stories being too simplistic. There wasn't enough realism in them, even though it may have been created as fiction and perhaps just entertainment for children. It was still scrutinized for believability, even though all the characters and events were fictional. Besides the characters not being very intelligent, that also led to easy entrapment and lack of believability, and also dire pictures being painted by melodramatic narration. There was a narrator who corroborated the stories with his own narrative texts, but toward the ends of the episodes, especially if some adverse situation had developed, there would be this cliffhanger notion. What's going to happen next? Has this really come to pass? What on earth is going to happen now? Stay tuned. Now, a great many of these flaws, the slapstick, the high degree of violence, simplistic stories, lack of believability, and the melodramatic narration were also typical of the Batman live TV series with Adam West. That series was probably much better known than the Underdog series was. What happened was, there were letters to the editor. There were indignant views from from viewers. They said, why must the show be like this? If it has to stay like this, it ought to be taken off the air. We want Batman to be more meritorious. You should make some improvements upon it. They wanted a more dignified Batman, so of course, when I saw the same flaws with Underdog, I wanted him to be more dignified, and I was determined to make him better. I was able to notice these shortcomings in the character and series because I was in my early teens when I first became involved with it.
With so many bad points, how do you think the character and show should have been?
Pretty much what I've said before. I wanted him to be involved in believable situations, and that he had to be more intelligent and avoid these slapstick mishaps that he was made to have. There's another animated superhero which probably came out of the Japanese system of animation. That was Eighth Man. If any of you listening have ever heard of or remember Eighth Man, he and his other sidekicks, and especially his adventures, were depicted as much more representative of real life. There were some tragedies, there were lessons to be learned, and on the whole, I think it was much more believable and dignified than some other series and characters with which I was familiar. Another thing that I didn't like about Underdog was his alter ego. When to disguise himself, he was a shoe shiner. I felt he should have had a more dignified alter occupation, or else have not had an alter ego at all. He was simply come and go as Underdog is needed, and then just disappear into thin air. Another significant thing is that when I went romping before the TV set the way many other child emulators probably did with their respective characters, I imagined that I wasn't the character himself. I was simply an actor, an actress, playing the part, and I imagined that there were other people with me playing the roles of the other characters. Because Underdog was a flying superhero, I used theatrical dance movements, the way I explained before, to portray him, especially when he was supposed to fly or come to the rescue. That's also why I say that I imagine myself as a performer rather than as the character himself. And I also improved on the stories in my own mind. Although they were not being telecast that way, I would analyze a story after I had seen it and improve upon it the way I saw fit, so that when that same story was run again a short while later, I had it with amendments and acted it out the better way. Between the negative pictures continually imposed on me by family and friends, and my inability as just an individual person to have appealed to the networks to get them to improve the series, I gave up impersonating Underdog in '68, and that I was 16 at that time. I figured that I wouldn't have anything more to do with him, that he was a closed chapter in my life. And it was just very heartbreaking in subsequent years, because I would continue to see the character pop up every once in a while with the programmatic and characteristic flaws I've mentioned being perpetuated on and on and on, so that I wondered in time, would people no longer respect him? Wouldn't they ultimately lose taste in him?
How did you come back to it?
I think my first step back occurred during the mid-'70s, because at that time I was engrossed in research of the real story of another character, which turned out to be a real-life person. He was believed to be fictional, but he turned out to be real and with an altogether different story. That was Dracula. I was researching the real story of Dracula, finding out that he wasn't a vampire, he was a medieval prince. And in researching his real story, I made up a series of dances portraying him as the real-life prince. I figured, well, since Dracula has to have his dignity restored, since he has the truth about him to be brought back to life, why couldn't I rehabilitate Underdog too? So I was waiting for an opportunity, and then in July of 1980, an opportunity finally came along. I found out about a science fiction convention company, which was headquartered in New York, as I later found, but was about to mount a show in Philadelphia, which is the nearest large city to where I live. Among its activities was to be a costume contest. So I figured that whatever costume I wore, I'd make sure to build some kind of presentation around it, and to make whoever I was portraying come more to life that way. So there was my chance to resurrect and rehabilitate Underdog, and that's the way it was. Ever since '80, whenever this particular science fiction convention company came around, I would go to as many of its shows as I could, and intermittently do a better, more dignified, and meritorious Underdog.
Once you came back, what were some of the differences between your former and your current means of impersonation?
Um, well, naturally, he had to be more dignified than he had been in the original cartoon series. Something that he had done, at least the actor whose voice had been Underdog's, Wally Cox, he had made to have Underdog always speak in rhyme. Now, even in the old days, I don't think I imagined myself as speaking in rhyme. Now that I had made a comeback, I did not speak, at least not in the course of a polished dance routine or what other kind of routine I was using to make him appear more to life. No more than I'm speaking in rhyme now. So I became more or less a mute Underdog when I was being showcased. Also, because I had gone back to it alone, there were no other people to back me up, no other people to play the other characters. Now Underdog was strictly alone, and he was on exhibition. You would not expect him to make movements which depicted stories, because, well, the stories wouldn't be clear enough without additional actors. I also don't, now I was not using as many dance movements as I did in the old days. In the old days, I was being, well, ballet brainwashed. There were all kinds of flashy virtuoso movements which ballet dancers made, but not all of them were authentic, that is, really appropriate to this particular character's needs. So I had to eliminate the inessential moves and concentrate strictly on the more accurate movements. Also, I had quite outgrown the use of strictly ballet. Ballet was too perfectionist for me. It was too regimented. I had become more drawn to the idea of Isadora Duncan, who believed in freestyle movement without presetting every step to memorize every routine and make it exactly the same every time around. Because, well, most of the time when I was still in a ballet phase and I was practicing, there wasn't anyone else with me to tell me what moves to make. So I improvised on my own, and ultimately I got more involved with freestyle interpretive movements done mostly to classical or light classical music, which was not automatically associated with a particular ballet or any other particular work. I used mostly non-committed symphonies, sonatas, concert pieces, and so on. Also, I never showed Underdog as his alter ego. I explained before how now Underdog would strictly appear as himself when needed and then disappear and leave everybody to wonder who he really was or how he happened to appear when needed.
How did you get started on your personal appearance circuit at block parties, charity fairs, public festivals, and parades?
It started in '87, that was 2 years ago. Up till now, the only times that I had done Underdog were at the science fiction conventions. Not all the conventions provided an appropriate opportunity to do Underdog. In fact, Underdog was not appropriate for some of the themes the conventions took on. It was also rather disheartening in '84 when it came time for his 20th anniversary that I really didn't get to have a really in-depth Underdog crusade within those conventions held in '84. But then in '87, I hit upon a new circuit. My church was about to have its annual fundraising carnival. They had always had what was called a kiddie carnival, one night of the time period in which much of the carnival elements were catered to children, and especially sometimes I had seen people wandering in costumes saying hello to the children, but without putting on polished routines. For 87, since I had come to learn that 88 was going to be Superman's 50th anniversary, I decided, why not I do Supergirl for this kiddie carnival and thus alert everybody to Superman's anniversary the following year. So I did, and the children were especially attracted to see me and especially eager to see me do some simulated flying exhibitions. And I repeated Superman, or rather Supergirl, for the carnival held that same year in 1988 when it was Superman's 50th. And from there I got the idea, well, obviously, activities like block parties, carnivals, and to some extent parades always go in for costume characters, so that's another circuit for me to try. I wrote to a number of upcoming events to see if they would engage me as Supergirl, and a number of them did. I made at least 15 appearances as Supergirl in 88, and then I figured, well, since 89 was going to be Underdog's 25th anniversary, I'd appear at those same kind of events and emphasize Underdog.
As for your Underdog costume and appearance, could you explain why you have no hound dog headdress or mask, and apparently you never did in the old days either?
Part of it stems from costuming traditions in ballet. Most notable is for some of these featured ballerinas. When they're playing personalities other than human, or maybe animal-human mutants, they don't wear these elaborate headdresses or face masks, which would either obscure their vision or maybe hamper their dance movements. Sometimes you see characters in these very bulky bodysuits to make sure that the impersonators look 100% authentic. But these bulky suits are not good for dancing in. They might be good for walking and standing still, but not for strenuous dancing. If anyone's familiar with some classic ballets like Swan Lake or The Firebird, Swan Lake concerns women that are half swan and half human, who change back and forth, but they do not wear headpieces that particularly have the swan beaks. All they have is kind of a little cap of feathers, and they retain their own faces and hairlines. And the fluffy tutus, the standard ballet dresses, would never be worn by birds in the conventional sense. And also, particularly when it comes to Firebird, the title role in that story is a bird per se, but the ballerina who does that also sticks to the classic ballet tutu, which a regular bird would not wear, and a simple feathered headdress, while she sticks to a very human body line, and especially face and hairline. Now in my case, my hairline, watch as I turn my head, is reminiscent enough of Underdog's hound-shaped ears for me to retain my own face and hairstyle without using a headdress or mask which would either obscure my vision or hamper my body movements when I'm dancing. Some of you might be familiar with the plastic or latex Halloween masks. Some of them don't always cover the whole head if you're trying to authenticate the wearer to be particular characters. They too have a face covering and then just two holes at the eyes, which is okay if you're just going to walk, but not if you want to be strictly authentic to your character or do some involved character presentation.